Let me welcome you to the 53rd Annual Research Conference of UACES. I'm Simon Usherwood, I'm the chair. It's a real pleasure to welcome you to Belfast, where I'm reliably informed the weather is always like this. I just want to say thank you firstly to the organising committee, to Vivian, to David, to Lee, for all their work in organising this. I want to say thank you to all of you for coming, for the contributions you've already made and will make over the next couple of days. And it's really just to applaud everything that the members of this association have done over the past year for this event, but also for the many other activities that we have as an association. And for those of you who aren't so familiar with what we do, I would direct you to the website where you can find out lots about other opportunities for events, for funding, always nice, that we have available. And I'd also say we've got various people who you might want to talk to. We've got editors from the Journal of Common Market Studies and from our new journal, Contemporary European Politics, who will be very happy to talk to you about turning your research into a publication. And you can find them around the whole of the event. And if you can't find them, find me and I'll find them. Finally, I'll just remind you that as part of our work to make this a constructive and supportive space, you have already signed up to, and I'm sure you have read, the Code of Conduct when you registered. And it's just really common sense. It's about being respectful, constructive, and making sure that we practice the values that we talk about and profess. On that note, I'm very happy to hand over to our first plenary and to David.
Thank you, Simon. And can I just say first off, on behalf of Queen's Welcome to everybody, delighted to be hosting UACES conference again. Delighted to see so many people here. And yeah, thanks whoever arranged the weather or brought it with them. We are very, very grateful here because it's been very dark skies and lots of rain over the last 2 months. So yeah, wonderful. Anyway, first plenary session, when we were thinking about the hosting the conference, we were obviously looking around for hooks on which to hang various plenary events. And we noticed 50 years since the first enlargement of the European Union. So we thought, okay, well, what an opportunity. It's not something which we've been talking about much in European studies, European integration for a few years. About time we did start talking about it, and what an opportune time to be doing it, given the recent discussions that are taking place. Our initial inspiration was, though, to sort of look back at 50 years. What does it tell us about the European Union? What does it tell us about the dynamics underpinning European integration? To what extent does it show us some sort of continuities? To what extent does it show us that there's been peaks of interest, troughs of engagement? To what extent was the 2004 enlargement, the Big Bang, exceptional, the norm? It'd be good to be reflecting back on it, particularly given that enlargement has been stalled somewhat for recent years. Let's say it was an opportunity to reflect at the underpinnings of the enlargement process, which has seen the EU pretty fundamentally transformed. Those of us who were studying back in the 80s probably never envisaged an EU with as many member states with such geographical scope as we see it today. We were used to thinking about the EU going from 6 to 9 to 10, 12. Would it go further? We got to 15, we got to 25, we got to 27, we got to 28. Okay, we've stepped back a bit to 27. We won't be talking about that in this panel. But yeah, there's a lot happening. I suppose it also gives us an opportunity to think, well, where are we now? Because we haven't had an enlargement now for 10 years, and it's the longest period in that 50 years without an enlargement. Yet we've got considerable interest coming from particularly the countries of the Western Balkans. We've still got Turkey's application there. Iceland's been and gone. Norway's, I don't think, going to be coming back. We don't know. But we've then also got the question there, okay, why have none of those states actually joined? How do we explain that? And how do we possibly rectify that situation, particularly in the context of where we are with the crisis, the war in Ukraine, which 18 months ago, we weren't necessarily, well, 2 years ago, we weren't anticipating, but has obviously fundamentally changed the dynamics facing us today around European integration generally, but specifically around enlargement. This time, since beginning of 2022, we've had Ukraine, Georgia, Moldova applying. We've had Ukraine and Moldova granted candidate status. Georgia's been given potential candidate status. We've seen Bosnia-Herzegovina given candidate status. We've seen Kosovo apply. We've seen lots of pressure coming from the countries of the Western Balkans for the EU to engage in actually facilitating their accession and the EU delivering on commitments it's made before. We've now got a debate ongoing in the European Union about readying itself. Charles Michel spoke last week about ensuring that the EU is ready by 2030 to bring about enlargement, raises questions about decision-making within the EU, and a lot of the old discussions about widening versus deepening that we lived through in the 80s and 90s have come back. Okay, it's a really interesting time to be holding a panel on this. And so what we've aimed to do is bring together some recognized expertise on enlargement, in Barbara Lippert from the Stiftung Wissenschaft und Politik in Berlin, John Brennan from Maynooth University down the motorway in Ireland, Helene Sjursen over from Norway and Arena, and Koen Slootmaeckers from City University in London, who are all going to be providing a variety of different perspectives on enlargement. Barbara's going to be looking at the significance of enlargement for the EU, taking a bit of a historical perspective, and sort of touching on some of the prospects for enlargement. John's going to be looking at some of the key drivers of enlargement and how those might have changed over time. Helene's going to be looking at some of the contributions that we've made in academia to the study of enlargement on what it means. And then Koen's going to be coming in at the end for looking at some of the rights and norms and their role in dynamics. And hopefully then we can move on to a hopefully fruitful conversation, discussion about what is a really topical issue in the EU, and I think one which is fundamentally important for the whole process of European integration. No more from me. I'm going to pass straight over to Barbara. We're going to speak for 10 to 12 minutes each, and then we'll open up for questions. So thank you very much. Welcome and enjoy the panel.
So, good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for the invitation. I will go right into the questions you raised and reflect a bit on the significance of enlargement for the development of the European Union. And I think this significance is twofold. Enlargement for the European Union over the last 50 years meant change, but also continuity and a lot of path dependence on the same time. I think when we look at changes are quite obvious. The EU is getting bigger, not automatically better, but bigger in terms of area, territory, population, market. It has new internal or external borders, new neighbors and new neighborhoods. And what I think is most striking is that enlargement has a horizontal and a lasting and maybe even irreversible impact on the European Union and its development, because it affects its polity, its politics, and also its policies. From an analytical point of view, it's often very difficult to attribute changes and developments directly to the cause of enlargement, but nevertheless, I will make some observations on this. First is, of course, that enlargement changes the constitution of the European Union and makes treaty change inevitable. So there is always adaptation as far as the institutions are concerned. We all know that seats in the European Parliament, size of the community, the council, voting is affected. But beyond what Article 49 requires, it also offers a window of opportunity for interested policy actors. And so the EU's institutions have always confirmed that the belief that a smooth relationship exists between what was written in the Copenhagen criteria, maintaining the momentum of European integration and growing growth of membership, and that these processes are mutually reinforcing. From the past enlargement, I think we can see that there were mostly cautious readjustments and not really fundamental changes caused by enlargement. There was no reversal of current trends up to now. And the mantra that enlargement should not happen at the expense of what was formerly called deepening, now we only talk about reform. I think this is very difficult really to argue. I think that it always proved very difficult to live up to this mantra. And I think it was only the reform package of the reforms of 1987 and the second Southern enlargement that proved that these processes are really mutually reinforcing. What we always have as a debate before in the run-up to enlargement and also thereafter is the effect on policies and of course the financial implications for the EU. Because after the 1973 enlargement, most countries that joined, with the exception of the Northern enlargement 1995, was that countries joining were poorer than the community average, and most of them were also heavily agricultural as far as the economic sectors were concerned. And so that is also true for most of the countries that are now queuing for membership. Enlargement mostly strengthened existing policies, gave a new impetus to them when you think of cohesion policy. It also pushed for new policies when you think of the neighborhood policy in the context of the 2004 enlargement. But there is an imperative that the acquis is non-negotiable for those insiders, and there's also a strong bias towards the insiders, the old member states, which mostly makes enlargement very expensive, because those who feel disadvantaged, they will be compensated. And you already see some movements inside the European Union to anticipate these future effects. Nevertheless, the EU holds up the fiction, whatever you want to call it, that enlargement is a win-win game for those who join and those who stay. Only some want to leave. Enlargement, of course, also reshapes the political balance, the power constellation inside the European Union. There is now much talk about a probable shift towards the East, and maybe we can discuss this future. Overall, I would say enlargement increases the already existing and increasingly strong political and social heterogeneity inside the EU. I think it's worth reminding ourselves that the EU system is highly dependent on states and their capacities to govern, and on their quality of democracy, rule of law, etc., governance capacity at the nation state level. And it is in a growing EU, I think, increasingly so that the question of the functioning of the system is concerned. On this background of change, the EU had in already the first enlargement of 73 developed a very conservative, a reactive, and a pragmatic approach to enlargement, which I would call the enlargement doctrine, to limit the risks of change, the risks to the existing acquis. And so the EU insists on the absolute priority to preserve the non-negotiable acquis. So convergence, even more than only alignment, is expected from newcomers. Flexibility is limited. I don't think that you can really make the case that enlargement is a driver of real differentiation inside the European Union. The whole approach is for candidates merit-based. It's a highly technocratic process, which has become increasingly politicized, and that undermined also the credibility of the whole process for the EU. Nevertheless, the EU wants to be and stay in full control of the whole of the process. So this doctrine really ensured that the EU could manage to maintain a lot of the old EU when expanding. When we now look at the future, many analysts think that we are now at a critical juncture, where some talk about some sort of liberal empire from Lisbon to Georgia or even further. Others are more concerned about imperial overstretch. And of course, the trigger for this is the war, Russia's war against Ukraine, and what is called the geopolitical turn of the EU, which is of course very much on paper. But for the first time, enlargement also concerns hard security questions, which formerly were outsourced to NATO. So what this new sense of urgency will mean for the European Union is, of course, to be debated here and at many places. But one point, of course, where you can trigger change and make a real maybe U-turn is that you change the enlargement doctrine and that you abandon this method that the acquis is untouchable. And so, for example, we have full and partial membership inside the European Union, or we will look for other more, let's say, creative solutions for third countries, strongly aligned with the EU, but still third countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Barbara. I'm sure we'll come back to the idea of this enlargement doctrine and whether we are at a critical juncture. Can I invite John Brennan to come up now and give his contribution?
Thank you, David, and thank you for the invitation to be here. David's brief was to focus on the drivers of enlargement, and it offers an opportunity to step back and reflect on the different phases of expansion and how different dynamics have played particular roles in particular periods. And I basically divide these drivers up into four different sets. The first is geopolitical. The second are economic and market-based drivers. The third set are normative or values-driven drivers, which Koen is going to address in more detail. And finally, there are institutional and bilateral drivers that have also always been present to different degrees. To begin with geopolitical motivations, the European Union as a soft power may not have had much of a geopolitical mission in the early phases of enlargement, but from the beginning, geopolitics was a factor encouraging or producing expansion. The UK's addition in 1973, for example, undoubtedly added military and diplomatic heft to the European community. In the 1980s, the expansion to include Greece and then Portugal and Spain brought the European community into the Mediterranean, and if not making it a Mediterranean power, over time a significant presence. The Barcelona process from the 90s onwards, and some of that you will recall. In the 1990s and 2000s, there's a more explicit geopolitical dimension, I think, with the task that the European Union had of accelerating the integration of Central and Eastern Europe. If we look at the 2007 expansion, Bulgaria and Romania had been left behind to some degree after 1998. But I don't think there's any doubt that the Kosovo War in 1999 was instrumental in bringing Bulgaria and Romania closer to the EU. And in fact, coming from Bulgaria, I've had discussions in recent weeks with colleagues, and I asked the question, what would have happened? Because you remember, there was a great deal of dissatisfaction afterwards that people say, well, they weren't ready to join and so forth. Well, what would have happened if their accessions hadn't happened in 2007 and they had been left to stagnate in this vacuum? Can anybody imagine after the financial crisis in 2008 that there would have been any enthusiasm for further enlargement, given that enlargement fatigue was already a phenomenon and was already becoming a problem in these different spaces? Most recently, without a doubt, over the last 590 days, I think the Russian assault on Ukraine has underlined the geopolitical dimension to this latest enlargement round. It coincided with the European Commission's drive to create a more consciously geopolitical Europe, and amongst other things, with President Macron's quest to achieve European strategic autonomy. If we look at the Western Balkans, again, I would argue the engagement came out of the EU's abject failures in the 1990s during the Bosnia War in particular. And more recently, I think you can make the argument that the kind of vacuum created by the EU's relative absence from the region allowed, to different degrees, China, Russia, and Turkey to become more important geopolitical players in the region. So there's definitely, I think, a geopolitical dimension to the revival of engagement with the Western Balkans. Inevitably, I suppose, as the EU grew larger, it was coming into close contact with, and sometimes conflict with, regions where geopolitics simply couldn't be avoided. And of course, the more recent debate is about the important longer-term strategic interests of the European Union, including competition with Russia and China. So I think you can certainly make the argument that geopolitics has always been present to different degrees in terms of different phases of the process. The second set of logics, I think, or drivers are economic and market-based. And again, I think there are interesting differences to be teased out between the different enlargement rounds. In 1973, undoubtedly, the addition of the United Kingdom changed a lot of the dynamics of negotiation and decision-making within the EU. Many viewed the UK's entry as a kind of counter to the statism and protectionism practiced by some of the existing member states. In the 1980s, economic motivations, you could argue, didn't feature as strongly. In fact, in 1977, the European Commission issued a negative ruling on Greece's application because it argued that Greece wasn't ready for membership, largely on economic grounds. Who comes to the Greek rescue at that time? The Germans, arguing that Greece had to be part of the European community because it was the home of European democracy. In Central and Eastern Europe, I think there are really interesting analysis of the economic and market-based approach. Two arguments, basically, that expansion, although it might prove a burden to the European Union in terms of subvention and redistribution in the short term, was going to produce new markets for goods. And this, of course, coincides with the launch of the single market in 1993. We shouldn't forget this is the 30th anniversary of the single market similarly. And secondly, as a location for foreign direct investment, initially very attractive because you had highly trained workers who were relatively cheap or significantly cheaper than in established EU locations. I think you can see this for sure in German support for enlargement in the 1990s and 2000s, and particularly the pressure from German business, from manufacturing and from other parts of German industry for significant investment in Central and Eastern Europe. And I think anybody looking at and trying to make the case for enlargement as being amongst the most successful policies of the European Union, you only have to look at the material difference it has made in Central and Eastern Europe, from Estonia all the way down to Bulgaria. The entire sort of physical fabric of that region has changed enormously. For all of the problems that exist in some areas of governance and elsewhere, nobody can argue, in my view, but that it's been an unqualified success. If we look at Bulgaria and Romania and the Western Balkans as well, you might argue that there are different dynamics in place, but even in the Western Balkans, you might argue these are small, fragmented markets, but this is a region where the population is about 20 million or so. It's about the same as that of Romania, and it's still important in respect of integrating supply chains and other things. A third set of impulses are normative, broadly defined. And again, there are a range of these. First, the sense that exclusion of some countries could not be justified, where other European states applied. What does Article 49 actually mean in substance? There were some, I think, who argued from the beginning for the notion of uniting Europe, that enlargement could and would facilitate such. And although there's still lots of academic dispute about where does Europe exactly begin and end, through most expansions, there were advocates who made the argument that expansion would further facilitate and help that goal of consolidating the drive for a united Europe. Third such driver, about rewriting injustices. I think you could see this was especially evident as a discourse in the 1990s and 2000s around Central and Eastern Europe. The notion that these states had been involuntarily excluded from all of the developments in European integration from 1952 onwards. 1989, of course, is of central importance here. And very quickly, the discourse about the return to Europe, which was used by Václav Havel and by Lech Walesa and many others, established itself as a very credible one, I think, in the eyes of many. It was very difficult for these so-called brakemen in the debate between drivers and brakemen to argue other than these countries have always been part of Europe and have a natural right to return. And again, in the Western Balkans, I think there is this view that the European Union owes the region, that it sat back in the 1990s and did virtually nothing while a fratricidal war took place on its borders and in its region. Finally, I think you can make the argument, and it's been made many times over the last year and a half, that Ukraine features similarly in this sort of mental landscape, that Ukrainians are literally spilling their blood for the values that are enshrined in Article 2 of the Treaty on European Union. And thus Ukraine's right to membership is derived at least in part because of the real sacrifices that are being made on a daily basis. Finally, the institutional and member state drivers. Now here I think we see the biggest sort of differences emerge over time. From an early point, the European Commission took the lead on negotiations. It was accepted that the Commission would do all of the heavy lifting and that member states would have an important role at a later point at the decision-making core of the system. But in general, there was very little interference from the member states as the negotiations proceeded. The Commission was often known as the quote unquote friend who tells the truth, as a trusted interlocutor that was in many ways acting on behalf of candidates as much as on behalf of the member states. At different periods, we saw some member states taking an active lead in sponsoring specific candidates or a particular group of countries. Germany's championing of the Central and East European countries, I think, stands out. More recently, Poland's sponsorship of Ukraine, which long predates the Russian reinvasion in February of last year. However, the tendency of some member states to interfere more and more in the earlier and earlier stages of accession negotiations has been a really pernicious dynamic in the process over the last 20 years, I would argue. In fact, you could argue that it has become the most distinguishing feature of a process that became almost paralyzed before the Russian reinvasion of Ukraine. Whether you attribute it to enlargement fatigue or to other phenomena, you can look at, for example, the Bulgarian veto of North Macedonia or the earlier veto of North Macedonia by Greece as just two recent examples of the kind of interference that demonstrates this changing balance of authority where the Commission in large part has been sidelined and where the member states, often on very narrow grounds, in the case of Bulgaria's dispute with Skopje, it's about culture, language, and identity, all the things that we should be discussing here and should have no part in these negotiations. So all of those things are there. You can see it, I think, that narrow interest-based dynamic in the Polish grain dispute that we've seen recently with Ukraine. And that suggests that future negotiations are not going to be easy. You can see it in other institutional arguments about the European Union's absorption capacity or lack thereof. Finally, for me, the most important driver of the process has been politics. Although enlargement has increasingly been presented as something that is hyper-technical and about convergence of standards over a period of time between outside and inside states, in reality, it has always depended on political will. And there is a kind of symbiotic link, I would argue, between the degree of credibility and legitimacy of the EU's promise to candidate states and the degree to which elites in those states take up the cudgels of reform. One of the really big problems in the Western Balkans has been that it is almost 21 years since they were promised membership of the European Union. Elites in the Western Balkans simply stopped believing that this would ever happen. So why should we be surprised that the reform efforts have stalled over many, many years? Thanks very much indeed. We can come back in questions.
Thanks very much, John. I think really good at exposing us to the range of dynamics there and also some of the major challenges we've got at the moment in trying to overcome what you refer to this sort of hyper-technical process, but highly politicized one where the member states seem to be having a very pernicious effect on the future of enlargement. Okay, third speaker, Koen.
Okay, hello everyone. Let me first join the others in thanking UACES and David in particular for initiating this panel and for the invitation to speak. That was a nice surprise. It's been a while since I last thought about enlargement, so this was a good opportunity to return to all of that. I was asked to speak about the question of the contribution of academic study to understanding the dynamics of the process of enlargement. So quite a tall order. Thankfully, David, you also suggested that I concentrate on the role of norms and identity. So this is what I will be doing. And you guys can tell me afterwards about all the academic insights that I forgot to mention. So I'll concentrate on how the emphasis on the role of norms has contributed to shape our understanding of enlargement. And towards the end, I'll also ask if this focus on norms has come perhaps with some blind spots or biases, and then where such academic analysis on norms might go in future. First, however, what do I have in mind when I talk about norms? Norms could be lots of different things. What I'm mainly thinking about here is the constructivist move in international relations, which came to the fore in the 1990s, and which then coincided with the so-called Big Bang enlargement to Central and Eastern Europe after the end of the Cold War. So it seems to me that this constructivist move, which brought the acknowledgement that norms matter, and that if we want to understand how international politics work, we need to find a way to incorporate this insight into our analysis. So this acknowledgement, it seems to me, also influenced how we studied EU enlargement and how we understand it today. So first, what are norms? Usual definition is that norms are common standards of appropriate or acceptable behavior. Some like to add also appropriate behavior for actors with a given identity. I think that perhaps narrows down the understanding of norms too much, but I will get back to that. The main point is that the study of norms brings the notion of an ought into the pot of understanding things, but it's not about prescribing a course of action. The study of norms in this sense is about trying to understand what happens. So it's not an idealist approach to enlargement. It's still about trying to understand, account for, perhaps even explain a course of action. Norms could be considered important for different reasons. Some, Jon Elster, for example, likes to emphasize the emotive dimension of norms. This would suggest that norms are deeply, deeply embedded in culture, habits, and that they're often taken for granted. Others emphasize the cognitive dimension of norms more strongly. So they would then argue that norms have a rational core. They're not only emotive norms. So actors could then consciously follow norms through a reflection on their justification. It might be harder to gain acceptance across a large number of European states for norms if they have only an emotive character, while thinking about norms as having a rational core might make it easier to understand how and why some norms actually have an impact and a relevance across a number of countries that are embedded in different kinds of cultures. So, enlargement. My suggestion is that the literature on norms most of all contributed to shape our understanding of the big why question. Why do member states agree to enlarge? Why do they say yes to enlargement? The literature on norms often frames this as a kind of a puzzle. Enlargement is risky, as Barbara has clearly explained to us. It comes at a potential cost for the efficiency of decision-making. I think John also emphasized that the balance of costs and benefits in economic terms are uncertain. So there's no guarantee that saying yes to enlargement is going to be beneficial to the member states who agree to it. So that's been very often the starting point for analysis of enlargement that focus on norms. They were searching for a different kind of explanation. And what this literature has tended to suggest then is the idea that enlargement is a kind of duty. Why a duty? Could be different reasons, and this is why I mentioned the distinction between emotive norms and norms as having a rational core in the introduction. One way of understanding the obligation would be to say that it's an obligation to one of us, an obligation to other Europeans. As John said, the Western Balkan states have a tendency to argue that the European Union owes them something. So this would be part of an understanding of enlargement that suggests identity is an important element, and that there is an understanding in this literature that enlargement can be seen as the result of an obligation to one of us. Another understanding of this obligation, which is also found in the literature, is more of a moral kind. So in this literature, the suggestion is that a decision to enlarge can be understood as due to a commitment to contribute to certain core principles: human rights, rule of law, equality, a form of government that enables the realization and protection of such rights. So these kinds of distinctions between different kinds of norms have also contributed to a discussion of understanding how the EU prioritizes between different applicant countries. So in the early 2000s, when Turkish membership was still on the agenda, it was analysis suggested that the arguments of an obligation to bring the rest of the European family into the European Union was an argument that was presented mainly with reference to Central and East European states. So the sense that you needed to enlarge to one of us seemed to be stronger with regard to Central and Eastern Europe than what it was with regard to Turkey. With regard to Turkey, the arguments were much more pragmatic. They were concerned with questions of security, geopolitics, the other driver that John mentioned. So insights from enlargement have brought a specific understanding. The emphasis on norms has brought a particular understanding of why enlargement takes place that is linked to different senses of duty rather than interests or geopolitics. I think I'm beginning to run out of time. So let me move then on to the question of whether or not this literature also has some blind spots or perhaps even biases. Let me just flag what I think might be the most important one, and that has to do with the demand side. those states that apply for membership and become members of the European Union. Here, it seems to me that this literature, which tends to rely on a concept of socialization in order to understand how such a transition from a candidate state to a member state is feasible and how the European Union can function effectively in the aftermath. This concept of socialization seems to assume a too smooth transition, that the change from applicant to member state and the challenges and costs that follow with that kind of transition have been assumed to be too easily overcome. So perhaps for future research on the question of norms, we might need to focus on the difference, for example, between copying and learning, and also reflect more on what kind of political processes can enable not just copying, but also learning and even mutual learning between new and old member states. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Helene. Plenty for there for us to be thinking about. I think particularly the extent to which the norms continue to play the same role they might do today as they have done in the past. And thank you for bringing in the Turkey question as well, which you've not mentioned much so far. Anyway, final speaker, Koen Slootmaeckers. I'm going to pick up on the rights issue and I think call for a new framework for analysis or something.
I also might be different because I like to sit down and talk. So I think it's nice to pick up where you finished, Helene. How do we think about the learning and the copying as question? I think I always think when I think of values and rights that are part of the enlargement process, I always have to first start questioning what we think is the European values and what they already are. I think we often take for granted the Article 2 values as they are something that are agreed upon, that we all know what they're supposed to mean. And I think when I think of rights as part of the enlargement process, I feel like we have to question what these mean. And I think one of the things that I always start with is wondering how did they actually become part of the European Union, particularly in the 90s, and this drive to human rights is part of the enlargement process. And what I observe is that actually all of these values are inherently political. They emerged as part of the discourse as actually a way of demarking the boundaries of Europe. Up until the 90s, the question of Europe, the Article 49 was always any European member states can apply. And Morocco applied once, rejected because that was no longer Europe, it was the content of Europe. But the real question of what is a European country wasn't really brought into question. With the fall of the Berlin Wall, suddenly that question became much more complicated. Because this whole of Eastern Europe that suddenly had to kind of brought in, but they were not yet European enough. So the whole idea then became, let's work on democracy, human rights as ways of making the difference between Western Europe and Eastern Europe as a driver then of change. And that's when we see the Copenhagen criteria emerging as a kind of precondition for applying to become a member state, which now these days is no longer a precondition, it's actually becoming fundamentally part of the negotiation framework since the Croatian kind of accession process. But so if we think of these values that are inherently political, that also has then consequences for what it means if we're trying to transpose those or export those to other countries such as Eastern Europe or the Western Balkans. If they are political, then what are they actually standing for? To me, they are always being empty signifiers. They are values that we kind of say, but we don't really have an agreed understanding of what do we mean with democracy? What do we mean with fundamental values? What do we mean with fundamental rights? And so it creates a kind of a difficult job if you want to export something that is deliberately left quite ambiguous. So what then has been done is we've been trying to translate these norms into something we can export. And so we've looked at the incarnation of these ideas and these values as they exist within Western Europe. So we've been start looking at institutions and laws as a way of capturing values, which leads to a lot of problems because it starts actually leading an idea of, well, if we put in these institutions in place, if we have an ombudsman, if we have a protector of equality or any kind of independent bodies that are there to protect people from discrimination, if we have the right laws, then these values will be socialized or learned, and it will be kind of assumed that over time the change will happen. Now, I've studied Serbia for quite some time now, and I think one thing is very clear, that it doesn't happen, right? So where does the problem lie? And I think the starting point is we have to accept it's political. But also we have to question the idea of progress, where it's located and how it evolves. So that's kind of always my starting kind of assumption is, if we take that kind of position, what then happens in the negotiations? Because we can't just export the values as they are empty signifiers, but then what actually becomes part of the negotiation of the content of these values. And we see through resistance of member states or candidate member states, in 2004, minority rights was highly contested. Now the current waves of enlargement, LGBT rights are highly contested. And what we then see is a constant negotiation of, okay, what is actually part of this equality? What is part of democracy? And we see a process in which, for example, in Serbia, we're trying to actually present a certain narrative that we are progressive, we have particular practices in place, but then actually the politics themselves are fundamentally opposing equality. You create an ombudsman, but the politics are such that they actually can't exercise what they're supposed to be creating. Or you have, like in Slovakia, the Parliamentary Committee on Gender Equality, which is meant to promote gender equality in the country, that now has become a committee that actually promotes family values. Because we are assuming institutions are a symbol of progress, are a sign of change, of that values have been adopted. But if we don't recognize that institutions are actually a function of power, they're a tool of power, that the moment that regime changes, also the tool of the institutions will change. So I think that to me is like one of the kind of ways I see norms and rights play out in the enlargement process as highly problematic. Now, there are also then within the process itself, a lot of problems. As I said, there is resistance from candidate countries, which leads to this negotiation. But also the EU practice of promoting values has been incredibly inconsistent for as long as it's been trying to promote these values. And I think geopoliticization has been brought up quite a lot of time, and I think it's really obvious for me, who studies LGBT rights particularly, how geopolitical concerns have always been a driver of key decisions in enlargement, leading to fundamental rights and values which are supposedly a precondition to enlargement or a precondition to applying for membership, have been shifted to become, or let's make it part of the negotiation process by having dedicated chapters to them, because the decision to actually make countries candidate member states was driven by geopolitical concerns. The war in Kosovo pushed Central Eastern Europe to become much more considered and faster considered than they would have done otherwise, leaving the Copenhagen criteria no longer actually applied. Also, the Western Balkans, similarly, I think we've seen where ICTY requirements have also, and the kind of dealing with the past, they've taken priority over fundamental rights. The moment Serbia stopped cooperating with ICTY, they dropped the conditions on fundamental rights. And only after cooperation was done, it kind of re-emerged, but at that point, the problem was already, what's my word today? The damage was already done, right? And similarly, I think LGBT rights currently, the pride parades in Serbia have been banned for many years, in 2011 to 2013. mostly because, and it was allowed by the EU because of Kosovo. And I think current day politics in Serbia, again, we see Kosovo taking over the entirety of enlargement kind of capacity and questions around equality, the Euro pride banning, very little kind of comments by European Union, or very mild comments, I would say, particularly because of the current crisis within the Kosovo. And I think it's also instrumentalized by the Western Balkan countries. They have learned from the Eastern European experiences, how do we play the European Union to negotiate the content of these rights so that we can perform Europeanness, perform that we adhere to these so-called values, but actually actively undermine these politics by promoting family values, promoting the anti-gender movement. And so, I don't know how long, I probably need to finish soon. Okay. So I guess there is, if we don't look at these values like as a political kind of process, we risk overseeing what it's not been changing, right? And I think we can't underplay the importance of it because it actually has fundamental implications for people and their lives. And I think that's the one thing where we might say that EU enlargement is a technocratic process, but actually, when norms and values become discussed, it's no longer just about laws, institutions, it becomes about people's lives. It becomes about whether or not people have the dignity to live their lives in a way that would be free of discrimination, of harassment, of violence. Those are technically what these norms should be about, yet somehow within the entire process, people have always been written out. Politicians don't talk about the people, the EU doesn't talk about the people, and quite frankly, we don't talk about the people often enough either. And I think that to me is fundamentally where we as academics have to change. We have a moral mission to actually think through what is happening. Why are we seeing such a contested Europe with the anti-gender movement being rife, the anti-LGBT opposition being everywhere, and not just Eastern Europe, it's everywhere. Why are we seeing this, right? And I think we have to, as scholars, have a moral obligation to try and understand how actually the EU enlargement process, the EU itself, has fostered the politics and allowed for these things to happen. And I think that's when I said I will have some different framework for analysis. I'm originally a sociologist, in case you didn't notice. But I think we have to move beyond people, because a change in law, a change in institutions without a change in lived reality of people, progress remains hypothetical. It doesn't actually mean nothing. So, and this also then, I guess, leads me to the final kind of question I will raise about Ukraine and what's currently happening, because we see again a geopolitization of values, the narrative that Ukraine is dying for European values, and which I guess in some ways it's true, but also I find it quite difficult to kind of understand what is being happening, because again, values are used for geopolitical arguments. The fact that Ukraine is considering a same-sex partnership bill, which is really important and it has material impact for people, but the way is the process in which it becomes adopted risks creating the potential for furious backlash after the war has settled. Because currently we see a coalition of unlikely bedfellows who are all fighting for survival. Once that threat is gone, we'll start looking back at what have we done in this crisis moment, and it might actually spark more crisis. And so the geopolitization of values is actually geopolitization of people's lives. And I think that I can't emphasize enough, and it really is important because, as we have, I think, all agreed, enlargement is geopolitical, and somehow values have become a tool in which we need to really center people in the analysis. I think I'll leave it at that.
Thanks very much, Koen, for that. I think, as with all the presentations, plenty of food for thought. We covered a lot of ground, I think, sort of revealing the multifaceted nature of enlargement, what it means for the EU. What have its drivers been? I picked up on the point that everybody comes back to geopolitics and the significance of geopolitics here. And obviously, we're at a very geopolitical moment with the situation in Ukraine, and it's going to be very interesting to see how that then plays out with enlargement. And I think each of you has raised a number of questions for us to be pondering there. Anyway, hopefully that's been food for thought. We're open to questions and comments from the floor, and we've got about 25 minutes. So can I take questions? Maxine.
Thank you very much to all the speakers. John, I know that you are pro, I think, the Western Balkans being brought into the EU and having a credible path. But thinking about what Koen's talking about, I wonder for both of you what a kind of credible and legitimate in terms of values enlargement process would really look like for the Western Balkans.
Okay, another question over here on the left.
Thanks a lot, Thomas Westhouse University. Koen, thanks a lot for this presentation. I found it really inspiring. I think that this is not just the question of enlargement. This is also the question of the communication with some Central European countries. Because in a way, I think values have sort of become the method for negotiation. And we haven't been able, I think we have ignored that there is no real consensus of what these values actually are, and how they should look like, and what should be really the unviolatable sort of core, and what is sort of additional values that are sort of European as well, but are not the crucial ones. And I wonder, to what extent do you see some sort of crucial ones? Do you think that we can come to that by redirecting the idea of the view from the institutions to the individuals? And do you think there is a possibility to construct the European values in a more practically usable way?
Okay, can I ask you people to identify who they are as well? Take one question there, and I'll do another round in a moment.
Thank you, from the University of Warsaw in Poland. One comment and two questions. The first one is that from our Central European perspective, I have the impression that if we were paying so much attention to norms, there would have been no enlargements from the 1990s onwards. The second thing is, aren't we in this discussion over the future of Europe after 50 years and talking about enlargement, submitting the fact that there is currently no high tide for enlargement within the EU itself? And shouldn't we also mention what the particular societies within the EU think about the enlargement?
Okay. 20 minutes alone. Koen, do you want to go first?
Yeah. You're going to run a lot of these.
Thanks. To begin with Maxine's excellent question about the Western Balkans, it does, I think, demonstrate many of the contradictions that are there in the process. Many people from the region don't like the analogy, but it's one that is often, I think, trotted out when trying to explain the relative failures of the last 20 years, that the European Union pretends that reform is taking place, and the candidate states do everything possible to do this performative Europeanization. And there's this enormous gap between the two, which accounts for the lack of progress. I think there's a lot of truth to that. How on earth can the European Union continually favor Mr. Vučić and his party in Serbia with all of the anti-European values that they're associated with? Why on earth is the European Union and the United States taking the side of Serbia against Kosovo in the latest dispute this year? There is a real problem there. Part of it, I think, goes back to the lack of a toolbox on the European Union side to combat regression from the convergence that was supposed to take place. Now, we've seen that, of course, spectacularly with Hungary and with Poland. And the EU has only very belatedly begun to tackle that problem by developing a proper toolbox that includes infringement proceedings, and they have been used increasingly against both countries. I would argue not before time. I think that's what we should be doing in the enlargement process itself, and we should be honest about the degree of difficulty and about the fact that many of the elites who are negotiating enlargement are people we do not want to see sitting at the European Council table. How many more Orbans do you want? But you need an honesty, I think, in the conversation. And one way you can get it, I think, is by transferring the heightened work on the rule of law that's taking place in the EU, including the explicit linkage between rule of law performance and budgetary disbursements or EU funds, and making it absolutely clear to the candidates, number one, we're going to differentiate, and number two, we will not hesitate to sanction and punish you if you are in serious transgression of your obligations. So, there's a very good argument, I think, for an injection of that kind of necessary honesty. But I think the only real incentive that elites have in the region to do the kind of sometimes very unpopular things that the EU demands is if they have a credible prospect of membership, and that's completely absent. And the one thing feeds off the other. The one negative dynamic feeds off the other. So in my argument, set the date, but make it very clear that there will be serious punishment of transgression. Thanks.
I mean, I would agree. I think the EU is trying to pretend it's not political and it doesn't want to intervene in domestic politics. And there's the problem. For it to pretend it's not intervening in domestic politics is where it actually allows for the elites from the 90s to remain in power. I think I always need to remind people that Vučić used to be Minister of Information under Milosevic, right? Like that to me says everything. Like he's a master of disinformation. He's a master of destroying our purpose. He's been doing it since the 90s. He was fundamentally part of the wars. So how can you create a democratic, value-based society if you are actually still supporting people who were masters of genocide? That to me is a big question. So I think we seem to stop pretending enlargement is a democratic process. It's deeply political, and as long as it doesn't accept it's political, it's never going to actually happen our conscious desires. So that to me is what I would kind of really emphasize, and I don't see it happening anytime soon, but at least we can try and tell the Commission every so often that they need to change their ideas. When it comes to how do we think about these values and how do we implement them, it's a really difficult question because part of me wants to go in my radical view kind of thinking, which is like this is the whole rights-based approach just doesn't work because we are all focused on a system of inclusion. We just keep trying to expand the boundaries in which we are accepting people to be part of society, which still drives exclusion. We can't have inclusion without exclusion. So to me, like we need to complete radical reason. It's not just about centering individuals rather than institutions. But I think one of the things I would argue in my own work is, at least if we start considering that these values, whatever we define them to be, and I think we need to get some kind of consensus, again, I think the EU's over in waiting at least 10 years too late to anything. And the whole infringement procedure against Hungary, where now is starting to define what are Article 2 values, and it's 10 years too late. And actually now it's more damaging than it would. I'm not convinced the Commission will win the lawsuit against Hungary on the breach of Article 2, at least not completely. I assume it will be tied to the internal markets, which then will create a hierarchy of EU values of internal market first, everything else second. I think it's much more damaging than what we currently have. So I think, yeah, so that's the EU, and I think we are ready today to get the consensus. But if I were to kind of, at least within the context of enlargement, think about what are those values, we have to start with society. We have to, I think, and I'm always thinking about Judith Butler's speech at Cambridge a couple of months ago, we have to start selling a project that actually allows people to imagine a future which they all want to be part of. Like we are in a neoliberal institution environment where we pit it against one another. Right? My rights are taking away something you were used to, but nobody's actually thinking about what are we trying to create for everybody. And that would be my political project, kind of thinking about values and kind of, well, and norms and kind of better future for everyone. But to bring that back into the kind of codified languages of human rights and everything, I'm not sure it works, because we are looking at the state for salvation, whilst the state is fundamentally an oppressive institution that is designed to oppress. But then again, as I said, I went to my medical field, so not necessarily the answer you're looking for, but I think it's where we should start looking at what is the human value we're trying to actually value, and dignity in the widest sense of it, kind of meaning is where we should go.
Barbara, would you like to come in on any of those questions?
Well, I would say I think quite a different view. I think when we talk about values and motives why the EU expands or enlarges, we should also talk about why countries want to come in. And I think that what we've learned over the 50 years is that there is one factor that drove all of the enlargement, and that's the economy. I think most of the countries look for market access, they look for money, they look for financial support, benefiting from it to, of course, improve the living of their citizens, and it's about mobility. Most of these, let's say, objectives are not necessarily linked to membership, but to also different forms of integration. And when we see that it is increasingly difficult to agree to forge consensus on the political values, how you call it, then one has to be serious and in a way also earnest and say, well, this is stretching too far if we still want to be also a functioning political system and polity, a transnational polity. And here I think we are approaching the limits maybe of the whole project European integration, which is, as far as the political system is concerned, to my mind still experimental. You can't compare it to any other kind of political system. And so we can't take it for granted that we can just expand and still have the same, let's say, standards as we had before. Also, the whole idea of the European Union as a community of values is, let's say, quite recent thing. We used to talk about European Union as a community of law. And where the EU is still successful also in pressing Poland and Hungary and other countries to play by the rules is to look into what is also in judicial terms questionable and where you can have a make a real case. And everything else is a question which takes a very, very long time to, let's say, accept that some countries have a different idea of society, etc. But that is something where you can't set a date and say that President Michel 2030 will reach this at this point. So I mean, some thoughts.
Helene?
Well, perhaps just add a reflection to Barbara's comment that when it comes to the question of why states apply for membership, the economic argument was probably quite strong, and that creates an interesting mismatch between the demand for membership and the economic concerns that were present, And then on the other hand, on the EU side, the notion that there was an obligation linked to specific values and norms. And perhaps this mismatch can help us understand some of the difficulties of transition and the underestimation on the part of the existing EU members of the difficulties of ensuring a transition and adherence to some of the political criteria for EU membership. It's just a hypothesis, really. When you talk about the need to think about people and what values they are concerned about, aren't you really talking about ensuring public sphere, a European public sphere? That's where people debate, question, and discuss, and perhaps some opinions can also change. If you have a fully working public sphere, which obviously the European Union doesn't have.
Okay. John, can I hold back and just take a round of questions, then you can come in with the comment.
One response for
Maximum of 10 words.
Well, I want to forcefully but respectfully disagree about this notion that we are reaching the limits of expansion. Firstly, we've heard this so many times before, and if you look at the absorption after 2004 in the EU, it was actually much better than most people predicted. The institutions did not come to a halt. In fact, in some ways, they became more efficient at the way they did their business. And secondly, as an Irish citizen who has benefited in this 50th year of membership so much from the rights I get as a new citizen, how can I possibly deny that to a Bosnian person or an Albanian or anybody else?
Okay. We'll have a debate later about how many words are 10, but there we go. Anyway, I think I've got 5 questions here. Abru first, and then Martin.
So coming from a country, with unending, story of accession or process, I was very intrigued by Barbara's enlargement doctrine, or that we need to break away, from this perception that the EU appears untouchable, and that there may be this, let's say, partial or gradual types of accession into the EU. I think Jamaica had written actually in 2013 in JCMS an article on that gradual membership of Turkey, but this would be applicable to any country. So I'm intrigued, or I'm very interested in the opinions or ideas of the other things. What do you think about it? Is gradual membership or partial membership doable from a judicial point of view, legal, institutional, and Koen from a domestic political point of view? What do you think about it?
Okay.
So how would you answer to Barbara?
Okay. Martin Bond.
Thanks very much. Now the privilege of an old man who's been around on this business for well over 50 years. I joined the EU's institutions back in the early 70s. And I think we are a bit missing the wood for the trees. This is getting very, very close to a major settlement of now global affairs, when after 45 it was a settlement of European affairs. And the light of Ukraine, we have to envisage some sort of settlement which will encompass the future of Ukraine. Inevitably, that will encompass changes in the idea of Europe that we have lived with over the last 2 generations, possibly 3. And when that settlement is made, it will not be made by the Europeans. It will be made very largely by the strength of Washington in relation to Moscow and Washington's relationships with Beijing. And in that triangle, there will be a limited room for maneuver for the Europeans. The Europeans will have They may just say in much of the detail, to be sure, the detail under which we will govern whatever the ensuing Europe is to be. But we will not be the decisive power that says whether Georgia is in or out. We will not be the decisive power that says whether Ukraine is in or out, or indeed some other major questions of the degree of in or out, half in or half out, that we may be inclined, reluctant to accept, but probably have to accept, because the Western European core of the European Union is considerably more developed than the rest of it so far. And the speed with which the rest of it can encompass the same sort of things which are assumed in the West is not being accelerated by the upheavals in Ukraine. That's quite clear. My big argument, my question is, why do you think that the institutions that we have now created and supported, made as strong as we can in Brussels over this 70 years, why do you think that they have any more say than the leading states of Europe in that settlement? And do you really think that the leading states of Europe will allow their interests to be subsumed in the 27 interests which are combined in that negotiating brief that we would otherwise imagine is normal in an enlargement?
Okay, not sure we're going to have all the time to answer all those questions, but thank you very much, Martin. Andrew, and then the colleague in white in front of you.
Yeah, Andrew Cross, University College Talk, and I think my question will tie in with Martin Bond's comments. Some of the panelists say something about the relationship between NATO enlargement and EU enlargement. Just noting that in Central Eastern European case, NATO enlargement ought to take first, and the obvious question is it conceivable that Ukraine or Georgia or Moldova would join the EU without first joining NATO?
Okay.
Since we're running out of time, I'll try to be brief. My name is Gavin Koen, I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Oslo. And I studied the Western Balkans and institution, so I appreciate other insights today. I had one question concerning the recent conflict in northern Kosovo. I fully agree the way that the EU and both the EU and US handled the situation was unbelievable, but I was wondering to what extent do the views of representatives of the EU, like their personal individual views, have a bearing on these outcomes? Because if we look at Lajčák, for instance, being former foreign minister of Slovakia, a country that does not recognize Kosovo's independence, how is he a negotiator in Kosovo-Serbia relations? I mean, this was something that was received with a lot of skepticism on Kosovo's side, and I would understand that. But what I don't understand is how did these things happen from an EU institutional perspective? How did they just assign what could potentially be biased negotiators? The first question, and obviously the impact that has in the region. And the second is, I fully agree with all the criticism towards how the EU is tolerating Vučić. I was just having second thoughts about maybe because I don't dare to make conclusions about politics in Serbia. I don't consider myself truly an expert on that, but if the EU would be more critical, and rightfully so, towards Vučić, how would that impact his popularity in Serbia, and what would be an alternative to Vučić? Because it goes back to that debate about preserving stability with someone, I mean, the political scene in Serbia, the other, let's say, political actors, would it be worse than Vučić? Is this the reason why the EU is so kind of still tolerating this politician? Is because everyone else is just simply so much worse and so much more threatening to the stability in the region? It's clear that's one of the areas I appreciate the response. Thank you very much.
Okay, was there a question up there? Yeah.
question, what's from the Institute of International Relations, Prague. My question is, before discussion of EU enlargement is not limited to EU-centric. And what I mean by that, until the discussion round, before we started talking about the interest of the application by applicant states. And this question has two implications. First of all, the decision not to or delay is also a decision with large consequences, which I think should be taken into consideration. It's not the EU initiating the process, it's the countries expressing their interest in initiating the process. So saying no also has consequences for delay. And second, maybe we at the same time underestimate the consequences of enlargement for the very same reason that we forget about other actors being involved. By other actors, I'm referring to the countries.
Okay, I'm going to give you all 1 minute each and pick up on any one of those questions that you want to. Helene, do you want to go first? And we'll go in the order we're sitting, okay?
Okay, thank you. First on the applicant states, to my defense, it was part of what I meant to say, but time was too tight. So, but the main point was really that the literature norms has not paid a lot of attention to that question. That is a gap in our knowledge, I think. The enlargement doctrine, someone asked about that. As a citizen of Norway, yes, I can confirm that it's possible to be a sort of graduated or a halfway member of the European Union. Norway is that through the so-called European Economic Area Agreement. So does it work? Yeah, it works. It does. The Norwegian economy is fully integrated into the single market. But there is a political cost. If you are a halfway member, you are subject to laws that are made by others. So the citizens of your own country will not be able to influence the laws that they have to abide by.
Okay.
So the graduated membership really is a question of dominance that will arise, I think, in some form. If you introduce that form.
Okay, John, a couple of comments.
Thanks. On the first question of graduated membership, well, there are all kinds of models that have been floating about for a very long time in Europe of variable geometry, for example. President Macron's idea of a European political community most recently, but the big problem with that is many people in the antechamber of membership, they see it as a substitute for membership rather than a route towards membership. And that's why I think there's been significant pushback, certainly in private, if not publicly, against Macron's idea. In practice, I think there's a lot of thought being given to this. It's an interesting think tank who's written about it. I still believe, however, that there's no substitute for EU membership, and the practical and credible prospect of it as a magnet for the kind of reform and convergence that the EU sees. Secondly, Martin's question about a settlement at the end of the war. I'm afraid as I listened to you, I was hearing all of the classical realist arguments about power, and what they all do is to ignore the participant states, in this case Ukraine. They deny agency to states like Ukraine, and I just don't think that's in any sense ethical. I also don't think it actually reflects the real world that we're living in now. Center of gravity of the European Union has moved to some degree to the east as a result of the war. Many of the Central and East European capitals, which used to be looked down on, remember what Chirac said all those years ago, about 2 decades ago, about taking the opportunity to shut up. Nobody would say that in the current dispensation. There's a new credibility, in other words, in Warsaw and in other capitals because of the way they responded to the crisis. And I can't but think that that will matter eventually. lots of caveats, especially about what happens in the United States. But I don't share that bleak assessment that the EU is some sort of geopolitical plaything any longer, and everything is going to be decided in Moscow and Beijing and Washington. Finally, on Kosovo, on that very interesting question, yes, it's ridiculous that we still have 5 member states that fail to recognize Kosovo. As a first step, I think that should change. Is there a problem with some of the people who are appointed? You mentioned Minister Blachak, for example. Think about the appointment of the current Enlargement Commission, Oliver Verla. Orban's man in Brussels, who wasn't even the first choice for the job, got the job, and he has been a real problem because he wants people like himself and Orban sitting beside him in the European Council, and it's produced all kinds of difficulties in Bosnia in particular in recent years. That hasn't helped. Finally,
2 seconds, finally. I know you've done 12 before now, but
one talk about enlargement, I did 12 finally.
Right.
On NATO and EU enlargement, I think the norm was more or less that we have this kind of dual enlargement, not with a, let's say, explicit linkage, but it was practically there. I can't imagine to have given this conflict-ridden region that we will have EU accession without NATO, accession or a functional equivalent, because the EU can't give any security guarantees or make commitments, although of course it produced already papers and conclusions that go into that direction. I tend to see the situation very similar, that the EU does not play a significant role in the future settlement of the post-war situation. But of course it has a role to play. It's about reconstruction, it's about sharing infrastructure, integrating the countries that want to integrate economically, mobility, etc. So there's a lot the EU has to do, and of course this is very much driven by external forces. The US played a role also in the case of Turkey, so it's not the first time that the US has a look at least at what the EU is doing in terms of enlargement. And I think this practical integration, where Ukraine was one of the leading countries before the war, that will continue. And so I think it is really a question whether we can have this kind of practical integration without EU membership, and that we might also find some new arrangements, because I think the European economic area is for countries that can accept the whole of the internal market plus flanking policies, which is still a huge challenge for most of the applicants, at least the three countries of Eastern Europe. And so I think that partial membership is something totally different, where you would have a lower status for members, and I would add this just this statement, but I would not recommend to go down that way.
okay, quick final comment, Koen.
Where to start? On the NATO question, I think if I look at the Western Balkans, Serbia is never going to be part of NATO. So that is a question that's not, to me, it's never going to happen. It's Serbia's biggest kind of external enemy. So that's never going to happen. So there will be a Serbia that makes it into the EU, will be our NATO. So I think we can take that as a starting point, and the rest we're going to kind of use, because it might be a norm that it's kind of done, but it will never be enforced. So I see an enlargement for Serbia if that ever happens without NATO enlargement. I think when it comes to the kind of EU-centered approach, I think a lot of the problems lies in how we analyze and theorize the do of enlargement. It is very EU-centered. So I think we have to, if we want to change the debate, we have to also decenter Europe in our analysis of enlargement. I returned to it and just rethinking the theories to maybe put domestic agency at the forefront to also then analyze how everything goes wrong. Because if we keep saying, oh, we need, that's the debate I always see. It goes wrong because conditionality is not well advised to do more conditionality. That's the kind of currency policy cycle analysis that I see. And we can't actually fix the problem of enlargement if we keep engaging in these theories. Because we will never actually see the agency that's on the ground causing this problem. And domestic is not just some influences in this theory, the domestic is all about the domestic. That's my argument I would make. And about the resettlement, I would totally agree with you. I don't see points to that. It feels like it's by keep saying that these are the actors that are shaping the world, we are actually we're making them more powerful than they actually are because we are saying they are powerful. And I think our role as academics, we are not neutral observers. We create the world. And so I think if you really want to create just role, we also need to think about who we assign powers. So I also quite respectfully disagree. I don't think it's a debate we should focus on, particularly not when people are dying.
Okay, we'll stop there. Thank you ever so much to our panelists there. As you can probably appreciate, we've spoken for a long time. Thank you.